Hello, all. Welcome to the second episode of the podcast series, Geopolitics Demystified. The topic today is how you can master geopolitics to a reasonable extent. It's an exciting subject that eventually leads us to not just traditional geopolitics, but almost every topic you can imagine. So the first requirement is curiosity. If you have the desire and an open mind to learn anything, you are on the right path. If you are ready to unlearn, you can learn a lot. If you are a Renaissance man or a woman, so to speak, you will love geopolitics. And if you can analyze objectively without prejudice or ideology, you will master geopolitics. So this means having interest in current affairs, politics, economics, history, geography, science, technology, military, sociology, psychology, religion, spirituality, culture, and so on. That's a long list. In the first podcast, we talked about why geopolitics matters. We discussed how geopolitics affects everything, not just wars and foreign policies, but our economy, trade, investment, jobs, wages, standard of living, infrastructure, education, food, healthcare, media, and even art and social norms. Ergo, if we must understand geopolitics, we must analyze and understand all that it affects. Read, watch, everything. There is a difference between knowing some talking points and understanding a subject. We live in a polarized world of Manichaean views. That is, everything is either good or evil. This is a terrible way to understand the truth, which is nuanced. Thus, if you want to become good at geopolitics, the first step is to have an open mind. Expose yourself to ideas from all sides, the right, left, center, and the fringe. Read, watch liberal and conservative media outlets. Follow independent thinkers on social media. Watch videos on Rumble or BitChute, not just YouTube. Take in all sorts of views without prejudice and slowly digest them to create your own analyses. Because all mainstream ideas are simplified for the masses, meaning for the IQ of a fifth grader or so. Similarly, Wikipedia has a lot of bias and propaganda. Thus, if our goal is to have an awakening, we must step out of the comfort zone. There's no need to be ideologically rigid. For example, we don't have to wonder if government is good or bad, free trade is good or bad, capitalism is good or bad, China is good or bad, and so on. Those are simplistic and reductionist ideas that destroy brain cells and prevent us from analyzing the complexity. How to notice and then accept or reject propaganda. Everyone claims to hate propaganda and hypocrisy, but we have plenty of it. Haha. It's because people can see only propaganda from the other side. And in the world of marketing and social media, everyone has become good at spinning their narrative with all sorts of logical fallacies. In order to convince themselves that they're not a propagandist, everyone lives in echo chambers, where their views are reinforced by people with similar ideas. And the ideologically fierce people are the most popular in these bubbles. The key to escape from this intellectual trap is to seek truth, objective truth. It's hard because you have to see the good and bad in each situation, person, party, and country. But it's okay because you can still like someone or something when they are imperfect. And whatever country you're from, the ideal way to be patriotic is to demand truth. That means if you are an American or a European, go read and watch some media from Russia, China, and the Middle East to get different perspectives. Propaganda and censorship are everywhere. In the US, it is more sophisticated. The CIA's infamous Operation Mockingbird, which was revealed in the 1970s, is still alive. The mainstream media has merged completely with the military industrial complex, and a multi-billion dollar censorship industry has sprung since Trump's victory in 2016. Thanks to AI and big data tools, the censorship is widespread and happens in real time. Every social media post or influencer you see in your timeline, every result of Google search, and every talking point repeated by mainstream media and the politicians is manipulated by unseen people and software programs. So these are the puppet masters behind the puppets. This is why it helps to understand psychology, not the academic psychology, but the practical and mass psychology that are used to manufacture consent. For example, on YouTube, you can find simple but profound experiments on conformity and groupthink. The first of such experiments were done in the 1960s and successfully adopted by the ruling class. Understanding the big picture. Of course, it helps to start with some big picture theories of geopolitics. The two basic factors of any nation are survival and influence. Survival means preventing mortal internal and external dangers. The internal dangers include anything from economic stagnation to extreme polarization or even civil wars. External dangers include outright wars or destabilization efforts by hostile foreign powers. For example, color revolutions, coups, or even assassinations. Sometimes countries lose their sovereignty and are forced to accept a tributary or vassal status. For example, countries like Germany, Japan, and South Korea are literally occupied by US military. And others, like Australia, are forced to be nearly 100% aligned with the US foreign policy. However, in an Orwellian doublespeak, these countries are considered as allies of the US. Once a country is stable and sovereign, it can focus on extending its influence outward. This would start with its neighbors. A country surrounded by friendly neighbors on all sides is a blessed country. Good relations with neighbors not only provide national security, but help with trade and economy. This, for example, explains why Russia wants Ukraine to be a neutral country and not be aligned with NATO. Eventually, every country will also try to have the upper hand in its relations with its neighbors. This is the concept of regional hegemony. For example, we can see this in the Middle East with Israel, which wants to cement its regional hegemony by neutralizing Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. If we look at the US, they spelled out the so-called Monroe Doctrine 200 years ago to stop European powers from having any influence in Latin America or the Caribbean. Very smart. Broad theories. One of the most influential geopolitical theories was espoused by Halford Mackinder, a British geographer and academic, in 1904. He described the path to world domination, and that is by controlling what he called the world island, which comprised of Europe, Asia, and Africa. And he split that region into two core parts, the Heartland and the Rimlands. The Rimlands comprise of the coastal regions from Europe to the Middle East to India and all the way up to China. The Heartland, on the other hand, was the landlocked region made up primarily of Russia, but also western region of China, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. Thus, Mackinder's Heartland theory was that who controls the heartland controls the world island, and who controls the world island controls the world. Few decades after Mackinder's seminal work, Nicholas Spykman, a Dutch-American academic and geostrategist, sort of reversed the theory. Spykman, spelled S-P-Y-K-M-A-N, claimed that the rimlands or the sea powers will emerge more powerful than the heartland or the land powers. Either way, when we use these theories as the prisms to view how the Western powers, from Napoleon and Hitler to NATO and the US, have been trying to conquer Russia over the centuries, we benefit from a whole new perspective. Now, it's not just a Disney version of geopolitics with slogans such as Putin bad or authoritarian Russia. There are also more contemporary theories, but they are mostly distorted by US propaganda and cliches. The phrase American empire is not in the mainstream lexicon. It is rarely used, and vast majority of people in the world, including Americans, even well-educated Americans, do not see the US as an empire. And every imperialist war that is intended to protect and extend American global hegemony is portrayed as a holy war that the US wages to spread freedom and democracy. It's America's perpetual jihad for freedom and democracy. But here's the fact. There is no logical reason for the US or the West to prefer freedom and democracy in the truest sense. Since the days of Edward Bernays, the US establishment has mastered the art of mass propaganda to shape and control public opinions. When people think what the elite cabal wants them to think, there's no freedom. The economic freedom in the US has two choices: neoliberal capitalism or neoliberal capitalism. The political freedom in the US has two choices: Democrats and Republicans, two parties controlled by the same puppet masters. Free speech is highly restricted in the US, especially since 2016 when Trump won the nomination and election. Free speech in the Garden of Europe is even a bigger joke. As for the so-called rules-based order, nobody knows what the rules are. They have never been written down for obvious reasons. The rules change constantly, always in favor of the US and its allies. For example, the US exempts itself from the ICC, or the International Criminal Court. The US has even threatened to invade The Hague or to arrest the ICC judges. However, at the same time, the US supported the ICC's indictment of Putin for so-called war crimes in Ukraine. And of course, when the International Criminal Court of Justice, the ICJ, found reasonable evidence of Israel committing genocide in Gaza, the US and allies quickly disparaged and dismissed the findings. Thus, contemporary geopolitical theories are mostly useless. However, there are a handful of exceptions, mostly because the truth slips out due to American hubris. Consider the book The Grand Chessboard: American Primacy and Its Geostrategic Imperatives. It's quite an extraordinary and candid book published in 1997. It was written by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a very powerful and influential geopolitical mind in the US. He was the advisor to presidents like Carter, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama. So when he published the book in 1997, it was the peak of American unipolar moment. Russia was crumbling and its GDP had fallen staggering 40% over the previous 5 years. And 500 million Chinese still lived in absolute poverty. There was nobody to challenge the US in the near future. Thus, Brzezinski could spell out the naked truth about the plans of the American empire. For example, Brzezinski blatantly talks about how the US should control its vassals and tributaries. He uses those precise terms. The two grand imperatives are, one, to prevent collusion among the vassals, and number two, maintain security dependence among the vassals to keep them pliant and protected. So in real life, you can see how this applies to, say, Europe. The goal of the US will be to prevent, say, Germany and France getting together to rise up against America's control of Europe. This means spying on European officials, controlling European media, and even hobbling the European economy to keep them down. As for the second point, NATO is the obvious answer to ensure Europe's dependency on America for security. Brzezinski also spells out a third imperative, that is to keep the barbarians from coming together. This could mean, for example, to prevent Russia, China, and Iran forming an alliance, formal or informal. Of course, the US has failed in this goal because that's exactly what has happened over the last few years. Brzezinski also talked about how the West should pull Ukraine into the EU and NATO. And he says that this would prevent the re-emergence of Russia as a great power. So this strategy, when we learn what was written in the past, we can see how the events that we are seeing today were planned 25, 30 years ago. But the narratives, they don't let us know what is happening. Another way to understand America's geopolitical strategies is to keep an eye on think tanks such as Stratfor and Rand, which are closely interlinked with the US deep state and military. The founder of Stratfor, George Friedman, openly stated during a speech in 2015, so this is exactly what he said. The primordial interest of the United States, over which for a century we have fought wars, the First, Second, and the Cold War, has been the relationship between Germany and Russia. Because united, they are the only force that could threaten us. Thus, we have to make sure that doesn't happen. Get it? The US must ruin the relationship between Germany and Russia in order to maintain American primacy. Imagine if the average German understood this. Would they have fallen for the Ukraine war? Or would they have accepted the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline? John Mearsheimer is another interesting geopolitical analyst. He comes from the so-called realist school of international relations theory. This views geopolitics as a wild, wild west of anarchy. In this mafia-like world, might is right. The US will and should try to maintain its hegemony at all costs. If that means trade wars, sanctions, color revolutions, propaganda, proxy wars, and kinetic wars in which thousands or millions are going to die, so be it. While there may be some truth in this view of the world, it unfortunately rejects a more spiritual and peaceful approach of cooperation and win-win options. So that is the view of the multipolar world. So if you look at the organizations like BRICS, that's exactly what they are shooting for. There's not going to be a hegemon, and the BRICS members, they come together and make decisions. They focus on development and cooperation and to improve themselves through synergistic and win-win cooperation. But of course, if and when the US becomes number 2 or number 3 in the world, there will be a whole new class of American geopolitical experts who will argue against hegemonic behavior. So when that happens, when the US becomes number 2 or number 3, they will also start preaching the benefits of cooperation and win-win deals. Conclusion. Mastering geopolitics is a journey, not a destination. It will be a lifelong process of learning and unlearning. The fundamental philosophy is there are no simple answers. And very often, there are no simple truths. There are objective truths, subjective truths, partial truths. We have to take it all in and slowly make sense out of them. And the geopolitical truth comes from all different fields, geography and international politics for sure, but also from domestic politics, history, military, technology, economy, trade, education, media, entertainment, healthcare, science, religion, spirituality, culture, norms, psychology, and so on. So leave no stone unturned. Absorb information like a sponge. Create an ecosystem in your brain where all these different perspectives interact with one another. Then there will be a slow evolution of thought process that leads to wisdom and enlightenment. That's the end for this second episode of the monologue format. Remember that we have 3 programs every week. Apart from this, I'll be interviewing an interesting person every week. Finally, we have a Spaces event every Friday on Twitter or X. You can follow me there. My handle is @Canthan2030. So that's my last name, followed by 2030. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful week. Cheers.